Morning again. Hey, and before I forget, I did forget an announcement earlier. That was that there's no ladies meeting this week. We don't have a ladies night planned for this week. So, yeah, I think that covers everything. Today is the end of a series that we have been in for, I think, 6 weeks now over the life of Joseph. And I'm so glad that you're here with us because even if you've missed every single other week up to this point, man, this week, the culmination of Joseph's story is absolutely amazing. And so let me just kind of give you the background about what we've been doing and how we've been approaching this story, right? Joseph, maybe you know the story, maybe you've only just sort of, kind of heard it in passing, but the story of Joseph is Joseph sold into slavery by his brothers. He had the coat of many colors and that whole thing, goes down into Egypt. He's sold to a man named Potiphar, whose wife she gets eyes for Joseph and decides she's going to make advances at him. He rejects her, and then that lands him in prison, right? And he's in prison for a long time. And over the course of his time there in prison, he interprets a few dreams, gets some notoriety and some fame, and then all of a sudden one day the Pharaoh, like the most powerful man in the civilized world at that day and age, has a dream and he needs someone to interpret it. And so who does he call? Well, it just so happens the guys whose dreams that Joseph has already interpreted works for Pharaoh. And so they gave him the royal hookup, and he ends up going and interpreting these dreams that say, man, if you don't do something, like the entire civilized world is going to be devastated by this incredible famine that's about to come over the land. So you're going to have these good years, these years of plenty where the land is going to produce more than you could ever imagine. And man, if you're not careful and you don't hold back some from the land, then after those 7 years comes another 7 years of the worst famine that you've ever seen. And sure enough, man, it comes to pass. And Pharaoh says, man, there's nobody like that this sort of wisdom resides in. And so he sets Joseph up as the number 2 guy in command there in Egypt. And at that point, we know from the story that Joseph's brothers are the ones who sold him into slavery. There's some bad blood there, but now Joseph is in this position of power and prominence. Dude, he could have them killed in a second and nobody would bat an eye in it. But last week we kind of began nearing the end of the story where we saw this amazing story of reconciliation. This is what we've looked at up to this point in the Joseph narrative. And this week I want to look at the end of Joseph's story in the very last moments of his life and what that sort of teaches us. And I told you that every week we've been looking at the story behind the story, right? That there's these immediately evident things that we can take away from Joseph's story, right? Forgiveness, that's awesome, and I don't know, waiting on God's timing, trusting in God's promises, and these are some amazing, really, really great things. But I said that actually this story has zero power to change your life. It's the fact that this story actually points our eyes forward to another story, and that's that story that has all the power to change our lives, right? And this is what we've been doing week after week. And I said, if we just focus on that foreground image of the things that the moralistic sort of lessons, then what we end up with are really just these moralistic and theological platitudes. Well, if you just hold tight to these things, or if you just have, if you just do what Joseph did, it's man, you have no power to do that. It's actually the story behind the story that has power to change, to transform our life. And that story is the story of Jesus in the gospel. And so every week we've been looking forward and seeing how Joseph's story propels our eyes forward to the story of the gospel. And this week we see Joseph finally die. And we learn a few things about that. But before we get into that, I want to talk about vacation. Who in here enjoys vacation, right? So there's a lot of good things about vacation, and there's a few bad things about vacation, right? Being sick on vacation. Anybody been there before? Dude, stomach flu at Disney World last year. That was the worst, right? I was and then the next day, going back and trying to ride rides, I'll never forget, man, someone had thrown up on the Avatar ride, and the next day, I'm already walking with a walker because I'm about dead, And we get to the ride, and somebody had like literally thrown up in my seat before we go. And so, dude, I don't want to get too graphic with it, but then it's like the virtual reality stuff. It was the worst 5 minutes of my life, man. And so that's never good on vacation, right? But then there's some things that are just kind of uncomfortable about vacation that make me long for home. What's something you long for after you've been in a hotel for a little while? Anybody? My bed. I knew that was going to be the unanimous one. Let me go a step further just because that's who I am and say my bathroom too, right? Anybody else? Like, dude, I just want my bathroom and I want my bed after I've been on vacation. And it doesn't matter like where I'm at. Like, and this is what's really funny is because like we go on vacation places and like my bed at home is pretty okay. Anybody like dissatisfied with their bed at home? I'm not dissatisfied with it really, but just like it's okay, And we go to these places and the hotel rooms and the bed is like heaven, just lay down. It's, oh my gosh, this is amazing. And yet by the end of the week, there's this weird, like I still am kind of longing for my bed. Is anybody connect with that? Is that like anybody else's experience? Doesn't really matter. Like we may be in Hawaii, right? And still by the end of the time that we're there, I'm kind of like, dude, I just have this like longing for home, right? Anybody felt that before? Maybe it's your own, maybe it's your own shower or toilet or bed or whatever the case, right? But after a while, it's like, dude, I want to be back home and I want to be back in my space because that space is comfortable. And at the end of the day, it's home, right? And here's the deal. I think there's something about this. There's this tension that is created in us as we look around the world that we live in. There's brokenness, right? You feel it every time you have an argument with your spouse, every time you have to get on to your kids, every time you turn on the news channel, right? I mean, that's all that is just like one long string of brokenness after the next, right? Like it's racism, it's war, it's economic or like financial disasters, it's ecological disasters and natural. It's like, dude, it's like the world we live in is broken. It's cancer. It's kids with terminal illnesses. It's abusive fathers and parents. It's broken homes. And like we look around this world that we're in, man, it's just like I don't know about you, but like I feel the same sort of tension and this longing for a place that isn't this. Anybody else? And I don't mean that in like a concerning you guys should call somebody sort of way, but like I just mean like, dude, I'm tired. Like, I get so tired. It's just this constant cycle over and over and over, and I'm reminded in every relationship that I have, I'm reminded at even the beautiful things that are still like broken things at the end of the day. You know that, like you see it. I'm reminded as I go to the grocery store, or turn on the news, or scroll social media, and it's just like this constant barrage of things that remind me that like this isn't my home. And it produces in me this longing and this tension for another place. Does anybody, or is it just me, right? I don't know if I'm like just sort of in my feels about that, but like I think there's a purpose actually. Unlike me staying in a hotel room where there's like actually no definable reason why I should be longing for home because we're in a bed that's way comfortable than mine on the beaches of Hawaii, right? And it's like, bro, be happy where you're at, right? But like, so sometimes that's not like understandable, but this is understandable, and it should make us like long for something more, something better, something that we were actually created for. I mean, this is the story of the Bible. This is a major theme in the book, like Genesis to Revelation. This is all throughout the entire course of the Bible. It's like we see this tension and we see people and groups of people, families, individuals that have to live in this tension of the broken here and now and long for something off in a future day, right? This is Joseph's story. This is how Joseph's story sort of culminates, and I want to like dive in headlong into that because the way that Joseph responds to that tension teaches us something. Here, let the Bible define the tension that I'm talking about, because I feel like sometimes my examples and illustrations can sort of get in the way. So I just want to read a passage of Scripture that really defines this sort of tension that I'm talking about really well. Romans chapter 8, verses 18 through 25, if you have your Bibles. And here's what Paul says to the church in Rome. He says, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that is to be revealed to us. For the anxious longing of the creation, like everything around us, our bodies, our relationships, the natural order and the cosmos around us, eagerly wait for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation, right, everything around us was subjected to futility." Do you feel like that? Relationships, work, even the fun, good, like beautiful things, that there's this element of like breakdown and futility in it, right? Not willingly, but because of him who subjected it in hope. For the creation was subjected to futility. Already read that, right? That the creation itself will also will be set free from its slavery to corruption into the freedom, the glory of the children of God. That God has a purpose in this. For we know that the whole creation groans and suffers the pains of childbirth together until now. And not only this, but we ourselves. It isn't just the natural world around us. It isn't just war. It isn't famines and natural disasters, tornadoes, right? It isn't plagues and pandemics. It's actually us too. We ourselves, having the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, waiting eagerly for our adoption as sons, the redemption of our body. Right? Man, I'm like in my early 30s. And I already feel this, right? I already feel like I'm trying to get back in the gym a little bit, and it's like, bro, it is not as easy as it was when I was in my early 20s, right? Like, it's a totally different, and it's like, I know that it only gets better with age, right? Like, I'm going to age like milk, and so it's going to not get much better than it is right now, right? Like, that's a sad thought. You ever thought about that? I don't want to bring us too far down, but you ever thought, like, it's as good as it's getting right now, man. Like, Let's move on, right? So here it is. For in hope, right? This is hope and this longing for this future thing. We have been saved. But hope that is seen is not hope. For who hopes for what they already have and what they already see? Man, we hope. This is that tension that we don't yet experience this thing. We hope for what we do not see, and with perseverance we wait eagerly for it. Dude, I think Paul says and defines this tension way better than anything that I could do, right? And this is it. This is the end of Joseph's story. Joseph finds himself in this tension. He is living in a land that is not his own. Right? Last time we left him, Joseph was at the pinnacle of his power and prominence there in Egypt. But what we know is that there were 4 generations born after Joseph. Right? Exodus chapter 1 tells us that the very next guy after the Pharaoh that Joseph served under forgot Joseph. And he actually began to enslave and imprison the Israelites. And what we're going to read today is that Joseph was alive to see 3 of those 4 generations. And so Joseph has watched the turn there in Egypt. Things aren't like they were when we first came into town, right? Like, yeah, man, like we're exploding and we're growing. But man, this last Pharaoh was even worse than the one before, and the guy coming up after him is going to be even worse than he was. And it's starting to turn ugly there. And he's in this place, and he's being reminded that this isn't his home, and there's this longing for and this pursuit of this home that is elsewhere. And in this, and in Joseph's response to this tension, we learn some things. So y'all want to dive in with me? You guys good? Everybody good? Everybody good? Is it too hot out there? We'll turn the AC on. I'm just kidding. We don't have AC. So, yeah, funny joke. It'd be funny if I wasn't sweating like crazy up here. So, anyways, all right. In order to go back and really like kind of understand this theme and understand what's happening here at the close of Joseph's story, we kind of have to track back through Genesis. And we've done this a few times already. We're going to do it again this morning, right? I told you guys, if you're going to understand Genesis, like Genesis is immeasurably deep, but if you can hold these three concepts of seed, land, and covenant in your mind as you read the book of Genesis, then man, you can actually come away with some really, really amazing stuff. And so we've been looking at Joseph's story in light of those things. Seed, last week we really focused on this idea of this promise, like chosen seed from the line of like started with Adam and it went down through Abel and then Seth and then, right, it just went all the way down through this lineage. We tracked that lineage and we saw how ultimately that seed culminates in the person of Jesus. Like it wasn't, this isn't plot twist, not Joseph's story. It's not Jacob's story either. This is actually Judah's story at the end of the day. And this is about how it allows Judah and his family line to continue on this like path of God's redemption and this story that he is weaving for God's people, right? This is Judah's story. So we talked about seed last week. This week we're going to talk about the ideas of land and covenant, right? So here's the deal. Let's go back and let's talk through a few things before we do that, right? Story opens up. Everything is perfect. Amazing, beautiful, like picture of creation. 2 chapters where we see God spends a lot of work making you for this place and making this place for you. You're an earthling, right? And this is really evident from the first 2 chapters. Like this place is good. God intends it to be this beautiful, beautiful place. And then by page 3 of our Bibles, we've broken it, right? And then the next like 10 chapters or 9 chapters are this expose of like human corruption and human brokenness in the human heart and how everything that is wrong with the world, the brokenness that exists therein is because of the brokenness that exists in us. It's this rebellion that happens on page 3 of the Bible, right? And this thing is infected every single one of us and flows out of us like a cancer into all of creation. And now that all of creation is like groaning for like a return to this Eden state. And this is the tension. This is what we felt. And this is what I've talked about at the beginning, right? We feel this at the end of Genesis chapter 11. It's like, dude, it's one mess up, one cataclysmic worldwide event after the next. And we're left at the end of those 11 chapters being like, man, something has to change. Beginning chapter 3 of Genesis, we're living in this land. We mess it up. And then don't miss this. God, this is Genesis chapter 3, 20 through 24. God, He expels us out of the garden, through the wilderness, and into exile. Genesis 3, 20 through 24. You get that picture. We're expelled out of this beautiful, amazing creation, walk through the wilderness, and into exile. This is meant to be seen in direct contrast with the book of Exodus, where we are coming out of exile, back through the wilderness, and back into this promised land. And there's some amazing symmetry and all kinds of awesome stuff that's happening there that we just don't have time for. But suffice it to say, we're in exile, right? Now, the story gets worse and worse, right? There's a flood, we rebel again, we're sent into exile once more. And then out of this land of exile, God calls a man. What was his name? Anybody? When you talk in church, I've really got to get you guys talking in church better. What was his name? I'm not going to give it to you. I'm going to sit here in awkward silence. Who was it? You can be wrong too, that's okay. But God calls a man, leave your country, go to a place I will show you. What's his name? Abraham. Yeah, so good. Thank you, Bonnie. 5 points to you. So God calls a man out of this exile through the wilderness and into this promised land. And then he goes to make this covenant promise with this man. Right? And so we need to talk about covenants for just a second if we're going to really understand what's happening in Joseph's story, right? A covenant is more than an agreement. It isn't just signing on the dotted line. It's more than a handshake and a verbal agreement between people. A covenant is like the binding of 2 lives together over a promise. Marriage is pictured as a covenant. That all of a sudden 2 people are no longer 2 people. 2 people are one person, right? And they're bound together over this covenant promise of like faithfulness and these, right? This is sort of the idea of this. It's way more than just a handshake or a sign on the line. This is a really big deal. And this idea of believing a promise, putting faith in the other party as the binding agent of this covenant is a really big deal in the biblical story, right? Don't Don't miss this. Trust in the other party, putting faith in the other party as sort of the agent that binds these two people into one in a covenant is a huge deal, not just in Joseph's story, but in the whole Bible, right? And so here's a part of the covenant that God made with this guy named Abraham that he called out of this other country, right? This is Genesis 15, 4 through 5. It says, "Then behold, the word of the Lord came to him, to Abraham, saying, this man, Abraham, has had another kid at this point, right? God has made this promise before, but Abraham kind of went sideways and had a kid with one of his wife's servants, and God says, no, not this man. This man will not be your heir, but one will come forth from your own body and from your wife's body, for that matter. And they were old and unable to have kids, so this is the idea of seed that we talked about last week, right? And he shall be your heir. And he took him outside and said, now look toward the heavens and count the stars, if you're able to count them, and obviously no. And he said to him, so your descendants be. This is a big part of this covenant, right? We've talked about that last week, the idea of seed and this promised seed that will come out of this nation that will bless the entire world, right? So this is the promise. Now let's look at Abraham's response. It says, then he believed in the Lord. He reckoned it to him as righteous. There's the trust. There's the faith. There's sort of the binding sort of agreement. And then, like very next in the story, something really weird happens. And I guess maybe weird for us. It wasn't weird for them. Is they get a bunch of animals, just birds and sheep and all kinds of crazy stuff. And God has them cut them in half, and like make a really bloody, nasty walkway for the two of them to walk between. Now, I say it's weird for us because that's not obviously, like, could you imagine going in to sign papers for your mortgage agreement, and they're like, did you bring the bull and the goat? We brought the birds, right? And they just like cut them in half, and you guys walk through, and congratulations, you're homeowners. Now, you guys can imagine that? We don't do that sort of stuff anymore, right? But this was common in their day, and here was the idea. They would make this agreement, and then they would like lock arms, and they would walk through as they spoke their trust about the other party. They would walk through these two animals, and that is to say, like, if I break this covenant, may I be like these animals and torn in half, because what's just happened is you're not two people anymore. This covenant has bound you into one person, and so to break the covenant is to essentially break part of yourself, and it is like, should be likened to you ripping yourself in half, right? This is serious business. And what's really strange, though, is God makes these promises, and he makes more than what we read there, but he makes these promises to Abraham. Abraham puts his faith in God as the binding agent of this covenant. God credits it to him as righteousness, and then God like knocks him out and says, you go to sleep, and I'm going to walk through the animals. God walks through alone. And this was weird, right? Because this was something that you were meant to do with the other person. This is like sort of like the wedding ring on your day, right? This is the symbol of your undying love and the commitment that two are now one. There is no beginning or no end to you, right? This is sort of like similar type imagery that they would have had, and yet God completely disrupts the image, and he is the only one that walks through there. And so let's just make a quick point of practical like application, if we can, from this picture, right? God's promise of blessing in his life, right, that he gives and he offers are not contingent on our actions. The picture that we see here, here's the deal. It's like Abraham like would never be and could never uphold the terms of that covenant. He could never do this. And God actually, he knows this. He knows because God has given us like, he started our story with literally the simplest command that anyone could ever follow or not follow, and it's, hey, don't eat that, right? Like, you have to be pretty intentional about, like, I mean, I can understand if it's like, hey, don't touch it, and maybe they, like, bumped up against it or something, but no, he's like, don't eat that. And no, they like, saw it, they picked it, and they ate it. He knows that even the most simplest of commands, even the most simplest aspects of the covenant, we are incapable of upholding. And so what does he do? He says, I'll uphold it for you. And God walks through, and he says, I know you're going to fail, and I know you're going to be torn in half, and you're going to be torn to pieces, but I'll take that as well. And God walked through the animals, himself. Like, Abraham's only part in this was to trust in God. Man, can I speak of a word of good news to you really quick this morning? Like, God loves you. Like, he's fond of you, right? Like he's got your picture in his wallet, fond of you. And here's the really good news of this is you didn't do anything good enough to get your picture there. And you don't have to keep doing things to keep it that way. And man, you didn't earn it. You can't lose it. And I know the weight that some of you struggle with because I struggle with it too. Because I carry around this feeling that I have to kind of constantly be measuring up to this standard. And there is good news in Jesus. When God passed through the animals, he was passing through for you and for him. And he knew you were going to break it, and so he did that too, and he's torn in half by it. Dude, I could camp out all day there on that, but if we don't move on, we won't ever get to where we're going, right? But just suffice it to say, man, that God's love extends above and beyond what you've done, and that needs to be really, really freeing for some of you today, right? So, let's move on, though. Part of God's promise, this thing is annoying the mess out of me. All right, part of God's promise, covenant promise to Abraham, was this land. It's the other piece. So we talked about covenant, let's talk about land, and then we can see Joseph's story the way we're meant to, right? It is this land of promise, this land flowing with milk and honey, right? It's beautiful. It gives of its fruit abundantly. They're going to possess houses they didn't build and vineyards they didn't plant. They're just going to walk into this land that's going to freely give itself to them. It's going to sustain them. That's going to bless them. That's going to bring about true rest. These people have known no rest the entire time they have been a people. And all of a sudden, this land is promising a type of rest. I mean, this is Eden. The imagery is meant to make our minds go back to this Eden imagery, right? And this is where God is promising to bring Abraham and his son Isaac and his son Jacob and his sons into this land, right? And this is part of God's promise. And remember, I said, you don't break a covenant, and yet Abraham comes to the end of his story. Has he possessed the land? No. He doesn't possess the land. In fact, the only part of the land that he's possessed is a little field, and it's a graveyard. The land at this point in Abraham's story is a symbol of death, right? It's where he buried his wife. It's not super great. And in fact, Abraham's had kind of a hard time in the land. And he doesn't get to see this moment where the story, where the land comes to be his, right? But we do get this whisper from God. This is Genesis 15, 13, and 14. God said to Abram, he said, "Know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed 400 years. But I will also judge the nation whom they will serve, and afterwards they will come out with many possessions." Y'all, this is generations before the Exodus. This is generations before Joseph even went down to Egypt. And there's this God is letting him know how the possession of the land is going to happen. And so, Abraham doesn't see the promise fulfilled in his lifetime, and the story of the land continues with Isaac. Does Isaac see the land in his lifetime? Does Isaac possess this land flowing with milk and honey? Anybody know the story? Does he get it? No, I'm seeing head shakes no. And you're right, he doesn't. We see this part in Genesis 26. He says, "Now there was a famine in the land, besides the previous famine that had occurred in the days of Abraham. So Isaac, this is Abraham's son, went to Gerar to Abimelech, king of the Philistines. The Lord appeared to him and said, 'Do not go down to Egypt. Stay in the land which I shall tell you.'" And this is incredible. This has a lot to do with Joseph's story, but we don't have time to land there, right? "Sojourn in this land, and I will be with you and bless you. For to you and to your descendants I will give all these lands." There's this promise again, I'm going to give you this land, right? "And I will establish the oath which I swore to your father Abraham." And he goes on. He doesn't see it. And then Isaac has 2 kids, Jacob and Esau, right? Do they get to possess the land? Nope. They get to expand it a little bit. Jacob buys another field, and emphasis on little, right? He has no more of the land under his control and possession. He's not living in this place any more than Abraham or Isaac was, right? And then we come to Joseph. And Joseph is out of the land altogether. And so it seems like the hope for this future land, this like land flowing milk and honey, is farther away than it has ever been before. And I want to read the end of Joseph's story. Now, this is Genesis chapter 50, 22 through 24. The land, we have covenant. This land flowing with milk and honey, this land of blessing and rest that God has promised to Abraham and his descendants. And the covenant is the promise that's predicated on our faith and our trust in God, right? And generation after generation has failed to see this promise come to fruition. And now Joseph, seemingly like he has led his family further away from possessing this than ever before. And now Joseph is about to die. This is the end of his story. And yet we see where Joseph's faith lies in this moment. Here it is. Now Joseph stayed in Egypt, he and his father's household, and Joseph lived 110 years. Joseph saw the third generation of Ephraim's sons. Also the sons of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were born on Joseph's knees. Well, that's weird for great-grandpa to be right there, but he was, I guess. And so Joseph said to his brothers, "I'm about to die, but God will surely take care of you and bring you up from this land to the land which he promised an oath to Abraham, Isaac, and to Jacob." Now, here's the deal. If you write in your Bible, circle, underline, highlight this next verse, because this is the key. These are his dying words, or at least the words that we assume were his dying words, right? This is his final sort of wishes that he makes known. This is the last thing that we ever hear of Joseph in his life, and here are his words. He says, "Then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying," check this out, "God will surely take care of you, and you shall carry my bones up from here." And here's how the book of Genesis ends. He says, "So Joseph died at the age of 110 years, and he was embalmed and placed in a coffin in Egypt." Now, before we look at the story behind the story, I want to just rest for a second in the immediate implications of this ending. You're an Israelite. Let's picture this for just a second, right? The book of Genesis was written to the Exodus generation. You know, the guys who like saw the 10 plagues and they walked out of Egypt, that crew, right? They saw the Red Sea split. Like, the book of Genesis was written and addressed to that generation. And so we have to understand it in the lens that generation would have understood it, right? So you've read this thing. You've watched as 10 plagues have ravaged Egypt, and you don't really know what's going on. You've heard whispers. You've heard whispers of a slave revolt. You've heard whispers of like, we're going to worship at some mountain, or actually we're just leaving Egypt altogether and we're never coming back. You've heard all kinds of sort of conflicting stories, and then like one night, in the middle of the night, you have to do this weird thing. You paint blood on your door and you eat this meal, and then you leave. And on your way out of town, like, all these Egyptians who actually have hated you up to this point are just giving you stuff like gold jewelry and like carts and camels and like food, and like, you don't know what in the world's going on, right? This is weird. And you're heading out in the middle of the wilderness, and like, dude, questions of what are we doing? Like, if we go back, they're going to kill us. Like, what have we just done? And so Moses hands you this scroll, and it's the book of Genesis. The book of Genesis gives us this framework for what God is doing in this plan of redemption, how he's leading his people out of exile through the wilderness into this Eden land. This is the story of Genesis, right? And we see its very beginnings, and we see these promises that, hey, one day after 400 years, God's going to lead you up from this land, man. You see this incredible, incredible story, and you've just read Joseph's story. How God is there, and God is working even the worst of circumstances for good. He's working it for his people's salvation and redemption, right? And you're living this right now. Promises that were only promises unfulfilled. You're looking up as you read this at 1.5 or 2 million people walking through the wilderness. You are now the nation that was promised in the book of Genesis, but never existed in the book of Genesis. You're this nation. You're walking through, and you've come to realize, man, that God's promises are good. God's promises are faithful. God's promises are trustworthy, right? Is that the feeling you get as you read Joseph's story? Yes, absolutely, right? This is going back to week 1 of our study. This is the feeling we get as we read Joseph's story, right? But you look up and you see 1.5 million people walking through the wilderness, and it starts getting hot. Not like a little hot, like it is in here, like hottest place on the earth hot. And you look around, it's like, bro, there ain't much water out here. And there aren't any 7-Elevens between here and the place that we're heading that can support, 1.5 million, 2 million people. Like, this is bad. What do? Option A, do you freak out and try to turn around and go back to Egypt? Like, well, maybe they kill us, maybe they don't, but I'm going to take my chances. Do you do that? Or do you look at the story that you've read up to this point and say, no, God is doing something like we just need to hold out. God's promises are good, they're trustworthy, they're true, right? They're faithful, like something is going to happen, like we just need to hold out, right? And they get chance after chance after chance to trust God like this, but they fail. They've got the story. They've got the book of Genesis. They've got Joseph's story, and they see how God comes through and how God redeems and rescues his people. They've lived it in their own experiences already, and yet they fail to capture the lesson that is really, really important. They fail to capture the lesson that God's promises are faithful, good, and trustworthy. I know I made this point on week 1 of the series, and so I'm sorry that I'm not more creative than that, but much like the Israelites, I think that we need to be reminded of this. I think this is a truth and a reality that we constantly have to go back to and remind ourselves over and over again, lest we end up making the same type of mistakes that Exodus generation did. Now, here's the deal. We've been looking at Joseph's story for 6 weeks. And we've seen some amazing and some incredible moments of faith in his story. We've seen how Joseph over and over again has placed his trust in God's good promises. And yet we come to the end of his story. And I think actually we need to propel forward a little bit. Because there's one moment of faithfulness and faith in Joseph's life that absolutely stands out above the rest of them. Do you guys know what Hebrews 11 is? Anybody know what that's called? The Hall of Faith? You know that? It's this part in the New Testament that talks about all these sort of heroes of the faith and in these moments in which their faith and how they placed their trust in the covenant promises of God come to define their life, right? And here's what it says about Joseph. Here's what it says. Hebrews 11:22. By faith, Joseph, when he was dying, made mention of the exodus of the sons of Israel. We just read that. That's that next to last verse in the book of Genesis that I had you highlight, right? He made mention of the exodus of the sons of Israel and gave orders concerning his bones. This is it. It wasn't Joseph in the pit. It wasn't Joseph's faithfulness as he was being sold into slavery that God, I'm not giving up. I'm not gonna rebel against what it is that you may be trying to do in this moment. It wasn't Joseph's faithfulness in Potiphar's house, right? As he trusted God in the moments where it would have been so easy to take hold of something else and seek his pleasure and his satisfaction from something else, right? And yet, he placed his faith in God in those moments, but it wasn't even that. It wasn't the moments that he was placing his faith in God for the interpretation of the dreams of Pharaoh. Bro, he got that wrong. He's going to get killed, right? That wasn't the moment. This moment right here, at the end of his story, and it's really weird because he's just giving instructions when you leave, take my bones with you. Take them back to the land. Joseph's Hall of Faith moment was when he was on his deathbed giving instructions about bringing his body back to the covenant land of promised blessing. Joseph knew that not even the seemingly final circumstances of death could separate him from the goodness, faithfulness, and trustworthiness of God's promises. Joseph had had enough evidence, and don't miss this because this is the foreground story, right? Joseph had had enough evidence of God's faithfulness from his own story that he could trust God, that God was going to deliver his people out of Egypt. He's been there long enough. He's seen how bad it's getting, and yet it's like Joseph isn't freaking out. He isn't like trying to look out for himself. He says, no. But calmly, cool, collected, Joseph says, when you leave, because you are going to leave, God is going to rescue. God has made a promise, and God's promises are good, trustworthy, and true. Like when you leave, like take my body back to the land of blessing. Right? Take my body back to the land. I believe this is the foreground image that we're supposed to read in this part of the story. Let me talk about the kind of faith that we're talking about in Joseph's story this morning. Does it take a lot of faith for me to like lean out and put my hand on things? It's like, dude, it's a concrete pillar, right? And it's gonna definitely hold me up, right? And plus, I'm not even really off balance. It may look like it, but I'm actually like still on my own feet here, right? But what about if I step out like, dude, I totally don't want to slip on a pick, and so if I eat it, be sure and put this on like pastorfails.com or something, right? But what about right here, right? Like this is a little like, I don't know, I'm sweating probably just from the heat, but this is a little more like dangerous, right? There's this point at which I have to step over what I can recover from, and I sort of have to trust that this thing is going to hold me up, right? Man, this is that moment of faith, right? I think that a true step of faithfulness is when we lean so far out that if God doesn't show up, we will fail. And Joseph had given himself fully to everything that God was doing in him and through him there in Egypt. And it would have been really easy as seeing himself like trapping the Israelites there in Egypt, but God had a plan. And Joseph like stepped out and was like, hey, God's going to take care of us, and he's going to lead us up out of here. Take my bones with you when you go. Let me give you a more practical example of this. About 6 years ago, I guess, now, or about 5 years ago, 6 years ago, 2015. It's 2021, holy smokes. We were in Florida, and we come to this crossroads moment. We knew that we were going to do ministry full-time, and we had pretty much come to the conclusion that church planting was what God had sort of for our future. And so I came to this moment where I could either re-enlist or I could separate. And God hadn't really opened any doors for the whole church planting thing, but re-enlisting was never part of the plan for us. And I was already like sort of put out with everything at that point. And so to re-enlist meant that we were going to move. And we had some idea about where we wanted to go and what God was maybe calling us towards, but to re-enlist meant that like that choice may be taken out of our hands, or it may sidetrack it for years, right? But man, we had enough evidence in the past that like, we're pretty certain that this is what we need to be doing, and so we re-enlisted, and then God was faithful, man, and He actually moved us right to the place where we were thinking that we were going to plant. Incredible, man. And the story, I would love to sit down sometime and share it with you. Like, just over and over and over again, there are these moments where we kind of have to just like, and lean out, and then like, it never fails. Every single time, like, God was there. And so the next time when it was a little further out, it was like, well, yeah, no problem, man. And we just went for it. Like, and I'm not saying that as some sort of like, hey, look at us, try to emulate. I'm just telling you what it looked like in our story. And so the big thing came this last year, May 2020, You may remember what was going on at that point, right? Like COVID was pretty much in full swing. That was sort of the moment we realized, like, oh wait, this is gonna drag on a little more than a couple weeks, right? It's just like this thing is gonna seriously impact. And the data and the verdict was still out on what this was going to do to churches. But I mean, all indications pointed to the fact that this was going to close down a third of all churches here in the United States. Not to mention the rest of the world, right? And so we come to this other moment where it's like, man, leave the military, May 2020, in the middle of this, and embark on what is hands down like one of the scariest ventures anyways, like planting a new church, or stay in the most secure job in the world, the one that you can't leave even if you want, right? Like that was the other option. And so, no, man, like I remember in the middle of that being freaked out because nothing that we had done up to that point worked the way we thought it did. I was at home one night and was getting ready for bed, and I'm just like sitting on the edge of the bed, having this like existential crisis of like, bro, what are we doing? Like, what are we doing? We thought it would look like this at this point, and I just remember Danielle, like, dude, like so. This happens way more than I would like to admit, right? She has to like kind of pull me back off the edge, and she's like, God didn't bring us out here to drown us. God hasn't showed up time and time and time again to like drown us right here in this moment, right? Like, and I think back to the Israelites story. It's like God didn't bring us out here into the wilderness to let us starve to death. He didn't bring us out here in the wilderness to let us like die of dehydration. Like God cuts promises, and where God has shown up in the past and where He is leading now, like He is faithful and good and trustworthy to lead you into what He is. He didn't bring us here to drown us. Man, in the early days, there wasn't a day that went by that I didn't have to go back and like remind myself of that. Like, okay, God, you didn't bring us here to drown us, right? And I was like over and over and over again. And I think this is what we see. I think this is the type of faith that we see in Joseph's story up to this point. He's seen enough of it in his life to know that, like, no, God's there. And as bad as things may be getting for my children and my grandchildren, like going into slavery, like it's turning really nasty, as bad as things may be getting, like God is He's going to be there. And he steps out in this faith moment, in this hall of faith, and he says, take my bones up out of here because you're going to leave me. Can you imagine the encouragement that provided to the children of Israel? I believe this is the foreground image. Remember I told you guys the foreground image actually has no power unless it's connected to the story behind the story. And so I actually want to go back and I want to read the context. I want to read the context that we read the Hebrews 11 passage in. And then we're going to close out. Here it is. Hebrews 11, this comes before Joseph's story right here. Hebrews 11, verses 8 through 16. He says, by faith, Abraham, right, when he was called, obeyed by going out to a place which he was to receive for an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith, he lived as an alien in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, fellow heirs of the same promise. For he was looking for the city which has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. By faith, even Sarah herself received ability to conceive even beyond the proper time of life, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore there was born even of one man, and him as good as dead. It's a nice way of saying he was really old, right? At that, as many descendants as the stars of heaven in number, and immeasurable as the sand which is by the seashore, of which they were at this point in the story. Listen to this. All these died in faith without receiving the promises. But having seen them and having welcomed them from a distance and having confessed that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For those who say such things, get this, man, they make it clear that they are seeking a country of their own. And if indeed they had been thinking of that country from which they went out, they would have had the opportunity to return, right? Thinking of Egypt, that is. But as it is, they desire a better country. That is a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. And if you were to catch up with Jesus on any given day when he was preaching, teaching, doing miracles, do you know what he would have been talking about? He would have been talking about this idea of the land. He changed the language a little bit, and he would talk about kingdoms. That this, on any given day, is what you would find Jesus talking about. Land and seed and covenant blessing. These are the things. And we typically think of land, like a kingdom, as like borders, and that kind of stuff. But in Jesus' day, a kingdom wasn't defined by borders. It was defined by where the rule and the reign of the king were. And so check this out. Jesus is the Savior seed of promise that has offered salvation from exile through the covenant of his blood that has opened a way into God's kingdom of blessing and rest. This is where our eyes are directed. What's amazing is now that we've read the Genesis story, do any of the patriarchs, include Joseph, do they get to see God's land flowing with milk and honey? No. Actually, I just said this, right? What about the Exodus generation? What about the generation that came after them, that came out of Egypt? Did they get to see the land flowing? No, actually they didn't. What about the Joshua generation that came in to actually possess the land? Like, did they get to see the land? No, it actually ends with a list of nations that they failed to drive out of the land. Like, they never actually got to see the land in its fullness. What about under David or even the best kings? Did they get to see this land flowing with milk and honey? It's like, no, we always messed it up. We always failed to practice rest the way that God commanded us to rest. We always fail to uphold our end of this like covenant. But they never got to see it. And what about in Jesus' day? Did after Jesus come, did we get to go into the land at that point? Did we get to return? No, man. Rome was still a power for years after that. And oppressing, killing, and enslaving God's people. And this was actually a really big problem for a lot of Jesus' followers. Like, do you realize this really messed them up, because they believed that when Messiah came, he was going to open in this land flowing with milk and honey. They were going to come into Israel in its fullness, the kingdom of God. They were going to get to experience this, and yet he leaves it and they don't. But Jesus isn't coming to establish a land with borders. Like, God's kingdom is defined by where the rule and reign of the king extends. And as we lean into the covenant blessing that Jesus made possible, that rule and reign, as we submit ourselves to him, to follow after him with everything that we have, that rule and reign now extends to our hearts. Our hearts and our lives become this little pocket of God's kingdom. Our relationships begin to reflect it as we submit to God's rule and reign, the laws of his country. And so 2,000 years later, we find ourselves in a place not far from where Joseph was, in this sort of already but not yet kingdom. I think that we have hope in the midst of our exile. Our lives, our relationships, our finances, even the world around us begins to reflect this beauty that is found in the hope of God's kingdom. I believe that as we lean in and we live in this already but not yet kingdom, there's a release of tension. There's a release from the tension that makes us focus our eyes, right? This release makes us focus our eyes on the God of hope and promise, and it drives us to live faithfully in the already but not yet. The release from this tension should fill us with an unstoppable drive to share the true message of hope. Redemption from exile is only found in a life submitted to Jesus. That tension should make us long for the coming of God's kingdom in its fullness and pray daily that it would come today. That we would be the generation that would finally get to see God's kingdom come in its fullness, right? This longing and this looking forward to, man, it unlocks a life of faithfulness, drive, and passion. So that we can say the thing that John the Revelator said as he looked out. John saw this kingdom in its fullness. And look at what he says as he concludes the book of Revelation. He says, he who testifies of these things says, yes, I am coming quickly. Amen. Come, Lord Jesus. I like how the King James renders this verse. Even so come, Lord Jesus. And so here's the question I want to leave you with as the band comes back up. Have you had your Hall of Faith moment? Have you had this moment where you look out across the brokenness that exists in the world around us and the brokenness that exists in your own heart? You've looked at the futility of us trying to fix our own problem. We can't elect our way out of this. We won't be able to technology our way out of this. We can't institute new laws to fix this thing. Dude, we are broken. And the thing that is broken is the thing that rebelled in page 3 of our Bible, and it's our heart. It needs a new leader, not me and not you. We need a better king than we can be of ourselves, right? And this is the Hall of Faith moment that I think that every person has to deal with at some point. We choose to reach out, to call out to Jesus, submit to the King of Kings. And I don't know where you came in here at, but whether you've heard that message for 1,000 times, it doesn't hurt to go back to it, because it's the same message, it's the same gospel that drives us to faithfulness every single day as it is the one that saves us. But if this is the very first time you're hearing this, and this is the very first time you've considered some of these things, man, then I want to give us a time to respond as we come to the close of our Joseph story. And we're going to sing one last song together. And I'm going to pray and in things, and maybe you know that you need to make that decision today. And here's the deal. You can call out to Jesus and choose to follow him with everything you have. You can do that sitting right at your seat. Man, I ask that you would tell somebody. We want to celebrate. We want to help you take your next steps of faithfulness after that. Or you can come talk to me. I'll be in the back. So I don't know where you're at, and I don't know what you need to do with this information, but I know that every person in this room needs to answer that question of have we had that Hall of Faith moment? And maybe you did at one point, but maybe you need to go back to it again and again and again and again as it drives us to live faithfully in the tension of the exile. I think that's what Joseph's story is pointing our eyes forward to. So will you stand with me? And I'm going to pray as we close things out. One last song, and we'll go on from there. Father God, we love you. We praise you, and we thank you that your promises are good, faithful, and trustworthy. God, I pray that we would live faithfully in exile. Pray for our people. I pray for anyone that needs to make a decision to follow after you for the very first time, that today, God, that they would make that decision before they leave this room. If anyone needs to follow you in baptism, God, I pray that they would do that. They would make that decision and make it public before they leave the room today. Pray for boldness in hearts. We love you and praise you and pray that you are honored and glorified above all things.